With that, our next conversation in this track is a fireside chat that features a relatively unconventional idea related to data for climate policymaking. We're very excited to welcome to the stage Nouri Garver, who is the CEO of Earthrise Alliance, and our very own Nouri, who's the president of the Federation of American Scientists, who will be leading the discussion. Please join me in welcoming the two of them to the conversation.
Thank you, Dan. First, I just want to thank Dan and his team for this incredible event and really the heroic job they've been doing to develop with the community and eventually unleash these 100 policy proposals from top science policy experts. And it's an honor to talk with you, Nouri, a top science policy expert who we are lucky to have part of this project, developing a science policy idea. And I just want to start with an op-ed that Nouri wrote, which ran in the Washington Post in July. And I encourage everybody to read it because it's fascinating. Forget new crewed missions in space. NASA should focus on saving Earth. And it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. Nouri, of course, in this piece, you argue that going to Earth and going to Mars should be secondary to what NASA should really be doing, which is to help solve climate change. And but it's particularly fascinating coming from you, somebody who has spent a long, illustrious career in space exploration, initially as an advocate for human spaceflight. Ultimately as the #2 in NASA. And so really curious just to hear about how your thinking evolved and how you reached where you are now.
Sure, thank you. It is not the person who writes the op-ed's job to write the titles. And so you might imagine that would not have been my preferred title. In fact, when it first came out, it said manned. Forget manned spaceflight. I'm like, well, we forgot that long ago. And they managed to change it to crew. But so I wasn't really writing with the intent to disparage human spaceflight in any way. I grew up at a time when we were very excited to be able to offer human spaceflight as a way to address what we believed in this country at the time was our foremost existential threat, and that was that communists would somehow be able to organize their science and technology in a way better than a democracy, and therefore it would be a threat to democracy. That is why we had human spaceflight. Let there be no question about that. And I, over my 30-plus years in space policy, have always felt very much that NASA and those funds we spend in the government must be aligned with national interests and the public's view of their own best interests for these dollars. And more you're seeing the policies and the polling aligned behind NASA addressing climate change. We have this incredible opportunity because of the work that we've done within the space program to utilize the perspective from space to address today's fundamental existential threat. And to me, that is a great opportunity for NASA to again do what the public expects of it, which is to help really save the world. And that is, I know, very controversial when you get a headline like ending human spaceflight, especially from someone who's spent her career doing it. And that only caused, I think, me to think further about the real value proposition. We have spent about $1 billion for every astronaut we've put in space, it turns out, in this country since the beginning. There are 7 billion people on the planet, plus, and we spend pennies helping them when NASA has this unique opportunity to do it. So to me, it doesn't have to be one or the other at all, but really, if you look at the opportunity today to take what we've invested in, not just in space, but in modeling, in data collection and storage, advanced computers, it allows us, I called Earthrise, the organization. RISE stood for the Renaissance in Sensing the Earth, because we are in a period of renaissance. So much has allowed us to be where we are today, to be in a position to help all of humanity. And that's what NASA does best. And that's when we were at our best. We've been trying to repeat the same old thing. Lots said this morning about sort of that, how do you overcome the inertia of the status quo? And that's what NASA has not been able to do for 50 years. So maybe it's because we're trying to do something that doesn't really address today's problems.
So thank you for that answer. So Nouri, what would you say to people, who say, yes, climate change is an existential threat. We have to focus much more on it than we are now, but it shouldn't come at the expense of space activities, because at the end of the day, space activity is about exploration. As humans, we're explorers. We have been explorers throughout our history. We inhabited every inch of this planet. And then more recently, when we developed better technologies, we started exploring the deep seas. And so naturally, the next thing is to go into space, and that has to remain the priority of this agency. So what do you say to that?
Well, I do believe that humanity is an exploring species, and ultimately at its core, we explore in order to survive. And so exploration for us is about, because in the past we and other life forms have needed that to fundamentally find new resources and be able to survive. So early on in my space career, I definitely supported space settlements beyond Earth as part of that human desire. And I knew Gene Roddenberry and a bunch of the people who've instilled that in so many of us. But to me, over the shorter term, and what we have learned largely from investments in space about our planet is we won't be in a position to do that if we don't invest here over the next 10 or 15 years, because we will not, while we might exist, we will no longer have a structure that can allow us to go further. And to me, you really find it very hard to accept there will be a time in the near future where it is easier technically to colonize somewhere else than to preserve life here. So no, it's not an either or. And I was involved in policies to help drive where we are going with reduced space transportation costs and so forth. And I love that folks like Elon and Jeff Bezos are investing their own money in doing those things. And they will tell you that's about human destiny. It absolutely is. And I forget whether it's 50,000 people, what Elon said he'll get by 2030 to Mars. Like, okay, I just think that's fine if he wants to do that. But if the NASA government focus, and in our founding 1958 Space Act, it says we are here partly to study the Earth, the atmosphere, and beyond. The Earth and the atmosphere are the first two things, and we are studying those and finding out we have problems. So part of what if I'm in the 100, I would love to be ideas, is to allow NASA and other scientists to go beyond just studying. Right now, NASA is in a position as if you were at NIH and told to study cancer, but not study how you would find a solution. So, ooh, there it is. Look at that. Wow. We ought to be able to focus on what we're doing about it. Who else is going to?
Right. And speaking of preserving a habitable planet, the poll that you referred to earlier, the Pew poll, showed that I think 63% of Americans believe that NASA's priority ought to be climate change. I think going to Mars was 18%, going to the moon was 13%. But what was interesting was that second, after climate change, 62% thought the priority should be detecting asteroids and doing something about them. And I have a 3.5-year-old son who loves dinosaurs, and he's really upset because he just learned that it was the asteroids that wiped them out. So I just, at least on his behalf, I have to ask: is NASA doing enough to detect and deflect asteroids?
That was one of the fascinating things about the poll that, to me, made sense. If you are a member of the taxpaying member of the public, you think NASA's helping you. And the things that are a threat from space right now are climate and asteroids. And in the Obama administration, we managed to shift the balance a bit towards some money for asteroid research, at least detection, not so much deflection. I think it was $20 million out of a $20 billion budget when we got there, and I think it's over 100 million now, and there's people here who have helped do that. There was some attention paid, but again, it's overcoming this inertia. If you put money out there, who said this morning, you get what you pay for, people will start to study that and become more supportive on the Hill and advocate for larger budgets and so forth. But right now, we've been putting money into Mars, so people are studying Mars, and that's where they want to go, therefore. Mars isn't going to hit us anytime soon. We used to talk about studying Mars to be able to compare planetology, okay. Well, how about, I actually totaled up the money we spent on Mars spacecraft versus Earth. We spent more studying the climate of Mars than Earth. That is crazy, in my view, as a taxpayer. And I know that's difficult for an organization that believes they're about exploring. But to me, you have the public paying for this part of the space program. They think NASA's doing this work, and we should. All the movies where asteroids are coming, NASA goes to save us. Well, not really in a position to do that yet.
Thank you. So Nouri, speaking of budgets, currently, if I have it right, Earth Sciences is around $2 billion a year at NASA. Human spaceflight and associated activities are 5 times that, about $10 billion, in a total of roughly a $20 billion agency. So what should the Earth Science budget look like? Say if you were NASA administrator, what would be your budget proposal? And second to that, what are the kinds of activities that we could be doing with a higher budget for Earth Sciences, climate observations? What are the things we would be doing if we had that money that we're not currently doing, and how would that help us with climate change?
Sure. I think, if just taking that poll, you look at the top 2 things the public thinks we should be doing and the bottom 2, we spend less than 10% on the top 2 and more than 60% on the bottom 2. So if you were to flip priorities, again, not eliminate human spaceflight, you would immediately be able to fulfill things like the National Academy of Sciences Earth Science decadal plans. Whenever those come out, it's supposed to be a 10-year investment plan. With our budget, we recognize it would take 30 years to fulfill it. There are these restraints on applications. I think the largest increases would come on what can we do with the data. In my view, part of this is just because you would not have to go seek new money, you could reprioritize within an agency to do something on day one, for instance. But you could also take the brand that is NASA to say, okay, one of the reasons we don't have full utilization of the data available, it's not just data from NASA. We, of course, have NOAA. We have the military intelligence community. We have private sector data. We need leadership. I think NASA is the obvious place, without starting a new bureaucracy, that could take a leadership position on standardizing data sets, making data available. I think NASA's also, that brand internationally gives you the ability to work globally. This is a global challenge of all government agencies. NASA is one of those most widely respected and recognized and trusted by the public. So if you're talking about recruiting, NASA's the government agency. I guess GAO doesn't have problems either, but NASA does not have problems recruiting. I would be interested in seeing something like a climate corps, a modern day Peace Corps. People want to come, use the data that we have about the planet, go to a local area and help decision makers and communities measure, adapt, mitigate, add resiliency to their current systems. They're not going to go do that for NOAA, probably. I feel like there is a role for NASA beyond just their measurement now. I think it's a leadership role within the US government, internationally, and probably overall to help recruit people to the cause.
Great. I definitely want to come back to the climate core idea. Fascinating idea. But before I do, I want to ask about if there is a sort of a flipping of priorities or more climate that could potentially come at the expense of human spaceflight. How do you navigate Texas with the thousands of jobs at Johnson Center, billions of dollars of NASA funding, Florida with the Kennedy Center, Alabama with Marshall? How do you manage those states and get them on board with this idea of strengthening the climate piece, which could come at the expense of those jobs and those dollars in those states?
So I am a optimistic pragmatist, recognize these are challenges, but I also live in a world that we all know from our discussions today can't be stagnant. And I cannot imagine beyond this president, whether it's another term or not, that a future president, the next future new president, would not want to utilize resources within the federal government to address the climate crisis. So if NASA is going to have a role that is growing, it is going to have to attach, I believe, to something that they uniquely do, which has a great societal benefit. We've been, gosh, I started in 1984 in the space business, and it was the 15th anniversary of Apollo, and we hadn't been back. People were mad after 15 years. We just did 50. Have we been back? Has anyone else? And we keep arguing it's because the president hasn't made a good enough speech again. We can't just live in the past and redo these things because we put in centers in the South, because Senator Johnson was there and we named a center after him. That is not a reason to have a space program. And I live in a world, because I would not be able to get out of bed if I did not, that will not continue over a future administration. So if NASA wants to continue to show the world its amazing capabilities, they need to adapt and address a current crisis. Going to the moon is not a current crisis. That is not something, unless we jump up China race for the 13th person to walk on the moon, then I'm not sure that's as big of a deal as addressing something that we are all feeling on this planet every single day.
Great, thank you. And to push sort of that political point just a little bit more, if you don't mind, then what do you say, to someone who says, NASA is a bipartisan agency, whereas EPA, for example, unfortunately, because EPA is in the environmental regulation business, has become a partisan agency. And if we really push the climate angle when it comes to NASA, we risk making that a more partisan agency. So how do we not do that?
So NASA has never been a partisan agency. In my view, we have had supporters from Republicans to Democrats, and we have had people opposed from Democrats to Republicans. Today, climate seems to be becoming more partisan. I was raised a Republican in Michigan as a conservationist, where this is not at all controversial. I think, again, beyond the existing president and maybe a couple of most outspoken leaders on the Hill, our elected leaders are going to recognize, because their constituents are feeling it every single day, that this is something to be addressed by the government. It is not partisan. Space, unfortunately, is more parochial. The problems have been that people just want the things in their district. So that's what happens when you don't address an overall global challenge, right? Because it becomes just the people who care about it. And that's not what made NASA great. NASA was great because they were addressing something we all embraced. And so I think we overcome that through purely being able to address something that more people care about. And I think overall, the climate crisis has to not be partisan. It's not really. I'm sure lots of you have Republican family and friends like me. They believe this is happening just like gravity. It's a theory.
We hope so. Great. So Nouri, in just the 1.5, 2 minutes we have left, I'd love to get your thoughts and advice to our viewers who are watching online. There are lots of graduate students out there in STEM fields, right? Studying to become engineers, scientists, and we have this graduate system where we're training PhDs to become faculty members, and we have fewer and fewer of them actually going to those academic professions. And schools aren't training them to the extent that they could to come work in government, work in public policy. And so I guess I'm just wondering what your advice is as the former #2 in NASA, which is an agency, has so many scientists, engineers, working at the technical levels, at the policy levels. What is your advice to the students watching online on how to leave their labs after they get their PhDs and enter government and do government service?
I feel there is that calling that others have talked about today that is universal. And again, if we at senior policymaking levels can allow the government to address challenges that do speak to, I think, earlier students, graduate students and so forth, that they feel there is a way to join and be part of a solution, probably the best thing we could do. It's hard that the government is viewed now in a negative way. I grew up in this farm community in Michigan where people did public service, and my grandfather was in the state house because they knew it was a way to do good. So the more we can do to that would be the better. And I do believe that the Day 1 initiative can do that, but I also want to sign up for the Day 2 initiative, because that's when you sometimes make those compromises that have that not to be the case. And we need to be so ready on Day 1, I think, that when people ask these questions, they look and say, we have the answers, we have the right people, this is the right thing to do, and to the extent we have some things to overcome politically, this is a democracy, and we ought to all, as the last panel talked about, have our voice heard.
Great. Well, thank you, Nouri. Again, we're honored that you're working with the project, your thought-provoking proposal. We're really looking forward to working with you and seeing the finished product. And again, for those in the audience and those online who do want to get engaged in this effort, we are at Day 1 Project and www.day1project.org. So thank you very much.